If you try to stop overthinking by fighting your own thoughts, you've probably already noticed that it almost never works. Maybe the problem isn't thinking too much. Maybe you're not thinking to avoid mistakes. Maybe you think so you don't step out of a character you learn to maintain. Overthinking doesn't try to control the future. It tries to control your internal image. But this approach is rarely explored. Most explanations try to teach you how to silence the mind, organize thoughts, or replace mental patterns. But what if overthinking isn't something to be interrupted, but something that needs to be understood before it can slowly lose its function? In this video, you'll understand why trying to quiet the mind often makes it even more active, and more importantly, what internal movement begins to happen when you stop treating your thoughts as enemies and start observing what exactly they are trying to protect. In the first part, we'll explore one of the main origins of overthinking, an origin that is rarely considered when people talk about mind control. Donald Winnicott was an English psychoanalyst who spent much of his life observing something that, at first glance, seems far removed from the reality of adults who overthink: babies. But it was precisely there, in the early relationship between the infant and the environment, that Winnicott found one of the most important keys to understanding how the human psyche functions throughout life. For him, the mind is not born organized. It organizes itself in response to the environment. And when that environment fails, not in extreme ways but subtly and repeatedly, the mind learns to adapt too early. When the environment is good enough, the child can exist spontaneously. They cry when they're hungry, become restless when uncomfortable, relax when they feel safe. There is no calculation, no monitoring. There is a natural continuity between what they feel inside and what happens outside. It is in this space that what Winnicott called the true self begins to form. Not as an identity, but as a living experience of being. The problem arises when this spontaneity begins to create tension in the environment, when the child senses, even without words, that certain expressions are not well received, that showing too much need is exhausting, that reacting unpredictably creates distance. That emotional dependence can destabilize those who are supposed to provide safety. None of this needs to be explicit. Often it happens in small everyday scenes. A cry that is quickly stopped, a feeling that is minimized, a behavior that is corrected before it is understood. Gradually, the child learns something essential. In order to maintain the bond, it's better to adapt. They don't stop feeling, but they learn to contain themselves. They learn to observe the environment before reacting. They learn to think before existing. It is at this point that Winnicott describes the emergence of the false self. Contrary to what the name might suggest, it is not a conscious lie. It is a survival organization, a psychic structure formed to ensure adaptation, acceptance, and continuity of the bond. The false self learns to function very well. It learns to anticipate expectations. It learns to control impulses. It learns to appear appropriate. And above all, it learns to think. In the second part, we'll understand why overthinking becomes so deeply tied to the preservation of your internal image, and why this makes it so difficult to simply stop thinking. Thinking here is not just reflection. It is monitoring, reviewing, predicting scenarios, adjusting one's internal image so nothing slips through. Thought stops being a tool used occasionally and becomes constant surveillance. Not because the person enjoys it, but because at some point in life existing without that control felt far too dangerous. That's why overthinking rarely appears only in major decisions. It seeps into everyday life, in obsessively rereading a message before sending it, in the discomfort after a simple conversation, analyzing every word that was said, in anticipating ordinary encounters, in mentally replaying situations that have already passed, as if something inside were always asking, did this keep the character intact? From this perspective, overthinking stops looking like a flaw. It begins to make sense as the continuation of an old function. Thinking too much becomes a way of ensuring that nothing spontaneous puts the constructed image at risk, that no unexpected emotion disrupts the balance, that the bond is preserved even at the cost of one's inner freedom. Winnicott said that the false self lives to respond to the demands of the environment. It organizes itself around, how should I be? The true self organizes itself around "how am I?" When the first occupies almost the entire psychic space, the mind becomes hyperactive. Not out of clarity, but out of vigilance. Not from an excess of creative thought, but from fear of breaking character. This helps explain something many people feel but rarely manage to name. Overthinking isn't there just to prevent mistakes. It's there to prevent exposure, to stop something authentic from slipping out unchecked, to ensure that the character remains coherent, predictable, and acceptable. The less space the true self had throughout life, the more the false self has to work. And that work happens mainly in the mind. Thinking becomes a way of existing without revealing oneself, a way of being present without truly appearing. That's why trying to stop thinking usually fails. Because in this case, thinking is not the enemy. It is the solution the system found. When you try to silence it by force, the mind doesn't interpret that as relief. It interprets it as a threat, as if you were shutting down the security system while the danger still feels real. Winnicott was very clear about one essential point. Psychological suffering does not arise from an excess of defenses, but from the absence of conditions that would allow them to become unnecessary. The false self does not need to be fought. It needs to rest. And it only rests when the environment, both external and internal, no longer demands constant vigilance. This is where the question, "Can I stop overthinking?" begins to change shape. Maybe the question isn't, "How do I make my mind stop?" but something deeper. At what point in my history did existing without thinking so much stop feeling safe? Because overthinking is not just a mental habit, it is a relational memory. It carries the mark of situations in which feeling freely had a cost, in which being spontaneous created tension, in which relaxing meant losing something important. The mind learned to stay active to protect something more fragile underneath. This also explains why overthinking often gets worse when everything seems calm. At night, in silence, when there are no external demands, for a system that learned to survive through constant adaptation, silence is not rest, it's risk. It's the space where the true self could emerge, and for a long time that wasn't safe. Winnicott said that psychological health is not the absence of conflict, but the capacity to be alone in the presence of someone. In adult life, this can be translated as the ability to be with yourself without constantly monitoring yourself. Overthinking appears precisely where that capacity was interrupted too early. That's why extremely responsible, functional, and self-aware people are often the ones who suffer most from relentless thinking. They learn to organize themselves before they learn to exist. Thought came in as a substitute for spontaneity. Understanding this doesn't make overthinking disappear immediately, but it changes something essential: your relationship with it. When you realize that your thoughts aren't trying to sabotage you, but to protect you, the struggle begins to lose its meaning. And it's precisely at that point that something new can begin to happen. Something that doesn't involve controlling the mind, but changing the relationship with what it is trying to protect. Winnicott didn't talk about techniques to silence the mind. He talked about experience, about gradually creating conditions in which the true self could appear without something bad happening, not all at once, not radically, but through small, quiet tests. And it's interesting to notice that in some paths, what begins to change isn't the thinking itself, but the way the nervous system slowly starts to test new conditions of safety. Overthinking begins to lose strength when, gradually, you allow small expressions of your true self to emerge and observe what happens. A less calculated response, a boundary set with less justification, a silence without explanation, a gesture that wasn't excessively rehearsed. Not to fully expose yourself, but to test whether the current environment is the same as before, to test whether so much control is still necessary, to test whether the danger the mind predicts actually comes true. When these small tests don't result in catastrophe, something very subtle happens. The system begins to update its information. Vigilance is no longer so necessary. The character can relax a little. And in that space, the mind begins to slow down, not because it was forced to, but because it no longer has to hold everything together on its own. Maybe that's why overthinking decreases in specific moments, when you feel deeply understood, when you're engaged in something creative, when you don't have to perform. In those moments, the true self finds a crack, and thought can finally rest. Winnicott reminds us of something simple and profound. The mind doesn't rest when it is silenced. It rests when it feels it can trust. And maybe, little by little, you'll discover that you don't need to stop overthinking. You just need to stop fighting what, for a long time, was the most intelligent way you found to keep existing. And maybe, as you hear all of this, you'll realize that overthinking was never a meaningless excess, but an old attempt to protect something that can now, little by little, breathe. If this video helped you look at your own mind with a bit more clarity, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we don't talk about fixing who you are, but about creating space so that what was silenced can slowly return to existing without fear.